The moment those 12 Federal K9s broke formation inside Cedar Ridge Federal Medical Center, every person in that lobby stopped breathing. Handlers screamed commands. Agents reached for radios. The hospital director pressed himself against a wall and knocked over a display case. But the dogs weren't attacking. They weren't out of control. One by one, all 12 German shepherds converged on a single woman standing near the supply cart. A quiet, overlooked nurse named Maya Whitmore, the one every person on that floor had laughed at that morning. The terrifying part wasn't the dogs. It was the look on their faces when they found her. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're going to want to stay until the very end. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Maya Whitmore arrived at Cedar Ridge Federal Medical Center at 6:47 every morning. Not 6:45, not 6:50. The precision wasn't a habit, it was armor. If she walked through the staff entrance before the morning shift crowd, she didn't have to answer questions. Didn't have to stand at the badge scanner while someone behind her sighed. Didn't have to watch the tiny shift in a coworker's expression when she opened her mouth and her words came out wrong. She'd learned a long time ago that arriving early meant arriving invisible. The break room was empty when she got there, and she moved through it the way she moved through most spaces, efficiently, quietly, without taking up more room than necessary. She poured coffee into a thermos she'd brought from home, because the communal mug sat on a rack above the sink, and reaching for one always seemed to invite conversation she hadn't prepared for. She checked her assignment sheet that had been slid under her locker door the night before. East Wing, 3rd floor, post-surgical recovery, standard rotation. She was clipping her badge to her scrubs when the break room door swung open and 2 nurses from the overnight shift walked in mid-conversation, not noticing her until Diane Kowalczyk nearly walked straight into her. "God, Maya," Diane pressed a hand to her chest. "You can't just lurk." "Sorry," Maya said. You're always just." Diane moved past her toward the coffee maker. The other nurse, Priya Sandhu, set her bag down on the table and scrolled through her phone. Neither of them acknowledged Maya further. That was fine. Maya knew that routine. She picked up her thermos and left. By 7:15, the floor was alive with the particular organized chaos of a large federal medical facility at shift change. Cedar Ridge wasn't a normal hospital. It operated under a dual mandate: civilian trauma care on the lower floors, federal contractor medical services, and a protected witness ward on the upper levels. The staff were vetted. The security was visible. Cameras covered every corridor, and there were checkpoints on the 4th and 5th floors that most of the nurses on Maya's rotation had never been cleared to pass through. She'd never asked about the upper floors. Asking invited questions back. The morning moved the way mornings at Cedar Ridge always moved. Patient check-ins, vitals, medication rounds, one difficult IV insertion on a post-surgical patient named Mr. Garfield, who had rolling veins and a strong opinion about nurses who took more than one attempt. Maya took 2 attempts. She apologized both times quietly, and he told her she should probably find a different career. She smiled at him the way she'd practiced smiling, enough to look pleasant, not enough to look like she was being insincere, and finished the check without another word. Priya passed her in the hallway afterward. "Garfield giving you a hard time?" Maya nodded. "Don't let him. He does it to everyone." Priya's tone wasn't unkind exactly, but it had the quality of someone talking to a child. "Just speak up when you go in there. Confidence. He respects that." Maya didn't say that she knew what she was doing. She didn't say that the insertion had been difficult because of Mr. Garfield's vascular condition, not her technique. She said, "Thank you," and kept walking, and Priya moved on to whatever came next, satisfied. The morning briefing happened at 7:30, and it was at that briefing where the day officially changed. Charge nurse Linda Ferris stood at the head of the conference room table with a printed memo in her hand and the expression of someone who had been given information she hadn't asked for. "Okay," she said, "we have a situation this morning that I need everyone to understand before they go near the lobby." She explained it without ceremony. A federal security unit was conducting an on-site exercise at Cedar Ridge as part of a broader regional preparedness review. The unit included 12 working K9s and their federal handlers, along with a command team that would be using the hospital's west entrance and lobby areas between 10 and noon. Staff were to remain professional, stay clear of the designated exercise corridors, and under no circumstances approach the dogs without explicit invitation from their handlers. "These aren't therapy dogs," Linda said. "These are working Federal K9s, trained for detection, tracking, and protection. You don't pet them. You don't talk to them. You don't make eye contact if you're uncertain." Questions? Marcus Webb, one of the senior nurses who had been at Cedar Ridge for 11 years and considered himself a subject matter expert on most topics, leaned back in his chair. "What's the actual point of having them here? This is a hospital." "The Federal Witness Ward uses this facility," Linda said. "The K9 unit is doing a sweep and protocol review. So they're going to parade military dogs through a hospital where people are recovering from surgery." Marcus said it like a summary, not a question. "They'll be in designated areas. The exercise is controlled." "Seems like a lot," Priya said. "It's a federal facility. A lot is standard." Linda set the memo down. "That's all. Go do your jobs." Maya had said nothing during the briefing. She had looked at the memo in Linda's hand, caught a partial glimpse of the header, Joint Federal K9 Operations Unit, and felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, something older than panic, something she'd spent 3 years burying under early mornings and careful routines and the particular discipline of staying exactly small enough to not be seen. She stood up when the others stood, and she walked back to her floor, and she told herself it meant nothing. She was almost convinced. The K9 unit arrived at 9:53 a.m. Maya heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of organized foot traffic, the click of radio communication, the way civilian foot traffic in the lobby went suddenly quiet. She was at the nurses' station on the east side of the 3rd floor when she looked over the railing to the lobby below and saw them coming through the west entrance in 2 columns. 12 German shepherds, each one in a tactical vest, moving with the controlled, coiled energy of animals that had been trained past instinct into something more deliberate. Their handlers walked alongside them, fit, clipped, professional, moving with the efficiency of people who didn't waste motion. And at the head of the formation, a man she didn't recognize. He was in his early 50s, broad across the shoulders, wearing federal credentials on a lanyard over a dark jacket. He carried himself the way command-level people carry themselves when they're used to being the most prepared person in any room. He spoke to one of his agents without looking at her, taking in the hospital layout with the practiced scan of someone assessing a space for risk. Maya pulled back from the railing before she could see if he'd looked up. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Federal K9 units had hundreds of personnel. She had left that world 3 years ago. The odds that any of those dogs, any of them, would recognize her in a hospital corridor 3 years after she walked out of a recovery program in another state were effectively zero. She went back to her patient rounds. For 37 minutes, it almost worked. She was coming out of room 318 when she heard the change in noise from the lobby below. Not an alert sound exactly, but a shift. One of those ambient changes in a building's acoustics that doesn't mean anything until suddenly it does. She paused in the hallway and listened, and then she heard someone on a radio say something she couldn't quite make out, and then a handler's voice, sharper than before. "Tighten, tighten, heel, tighten," and then the silence that comes right before something unexpected. She was still standing in the corridor when the elevator at the end of the hall opened. The dog that came through it was a German shepherd, 8 years old by her estimate, with a scar running along his left shoulder that she would have recognized in a photograph. He wasn't moving erratically. He wasn't aggressive. He was moving with the focused, deliberate certainty of an animal that knows exactly where it's going, pulling against a leash held by a handler who was clearly not expecting to be pulled anywhere. Titan stopped 12 feet from Maya Whitmore and went completely still. His eyes locked onto her. His ears came forward. His tail, the same tail she had watched drag against kennel floors during the worst weeks of his recovery, rose slowly. "Titan," the handler said again, uncertainty replacing the command edge in his voice. Maya stood absolutely still. She knew better than to move suddenly. She also knew, with a certainty that landed in her stomach like a stone, that the morning she'd spent trying to make herself invisible was over. The second elevator opened, then the stairwell door, 2 dogs, then 4, then the sound of rapid movement in the lobby below, voices rising not in alarm but in confusion, handlers trying to redirect animals who had already made a decision. The K9s didn't bark. They didn't rush. They came to her floor with the orderly, purposeful movement of a unit executing a known objective, and they arranged themselves around Maya in the east corridor of the third floor in a loose arc, ears forward, watching her with the collective attention of animals who had spent months learning what it felt like to be safe. Every nurse on the floor had stopped moving. Marcus Webb had come out of a patient room and was standing 20 feet away with his mouth slightly open. Priya had her back pressed to the wall near the nurse's station. Linda Ferris arrived at the top of the stairwell, behind the last of the K9s, and stood in the doorway looking at Maya with an expression Maya had never seen on her face before. Something between alarm and complete incomprehension. The Federal commander came through the stairwell behind Linda. He took in the scene, 12 K9s positioned around a nurse in blue scrubs who was standing very still in the center of the corridor, and his face did something complicated. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was a question underneath it he hadn't decided how to ask yet. "These animals have broken formation during an active federal exercise." "I know," Maya said. "They appear to have located you specifically." "Yes." He studied her for a moment. He had the eyes of a man who had learned to look at situations rather than people, to assess rather than react. "I'm Commander Draven Holt, Joint Federal K9 Operations. And you are—" She took a breath. The old discipline kicked in. The particular kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with having survived things that required it. "Maya W. Whitmore," she said. "I'm a nurse here." Holt looked at the dogs, looked at her, looked at the dogs again. Titan had moved forward and was now sitting directly at her left side with the relaxed, settled posture of an animal that had reached its destination. "Ma'am," Holt said carefully, "I've worked with this unit for 4 years. I've never seen Titan break formation for anyone." "He doesn't do it often," Maya said. There was a beat of silence. "You're familiar with this animal?" It wasn't quite a question. Maya looked at Titan, at the scar on his shoulder, at the way his breathing had slowed since he'd reached her, and she said nothing for a moment because the answer was not a simple one, and the corridor was full of people who had, until 11 minutes ago, been watching her fumble an IV insertion and dismissing her stutter with patient, barely concealed condescension. "We've met," she said finally. Behind her, she heard Marcus Webb say something under his breath to Priya. She couldn't make out the words, but she'd had enough experience with his particular brand of commentary to fill in the general shape of them. Holt took a step closer. "I'm going to need more than that." The thing about Commander Draven Holt, Maya would think later, was that he asked questions like someone who was used to getting answers. He had the bearing of a man who had spent his career in environments where ambiguity was a liability, where every piece of information either served the mission or didn't, and where the people around him either kept up or got moved aside. What he was not used to was being in a hospital corridor with 12 elite K9s voluntarily surrounding a quiet nurse, while a charge nurse and 3 other staff members stood 15 feet away, trying to process the situation through the limited frame of their assumptions about who she was. "Ms. Whitmore." His voice dropped. Not warmer exactly, but lower. The register people use when they want a private conversation in a public space. "I need you to understand that this exercise has federal oversight. These animals breaking formation is a documented incident. I have to explain it in my report." "I understand that. So help me explain it." Maya looked at him steadily. She was aware of Linda Ferris watching from the stairwell door, aware of Marcus still standing in the corridor with his arms crossed now, the posture of a man who had rearranged his confusion into skepticism because skepticism was more comfortable. "Not here," Maya said. Holt looked at the corridor, at the audience that had assembled itself around them, and he nodded once. "My team has a command post in the East Conference Room, first floor." "I have patience," Linda spoke from the doorway. Her voice was careful. "I'll cover your floor, Maya." Maya looked at her. Linda's expression had changed again. The incomprehension had settled into something more attentive. Whatever Linda Ferris thought she understood about Maya Whitmore, the last 8 minutes had introduced variables she hadn't accounted for. "Okay," Maya said. She walked toward the stairwell, and Titan walked beside her without being instructed, and 4 of the other K9s fell into a loose formation around them, and Marcus Webb watched the whole thing with an expression that had finally run out of categories to put itself in. The East Conference Room on the first floor had been converted into an operational space. Laptops, radios, printed maps of the hospital's floor plan on the table, a coffee set up in the corner that looked like it had been running since before dawn. 2 federal agents were inside when Maya and Holt arrived. They looked at Titan, and the other dogs who had followed looked at Maya and looked at Holt for direction. "Give us the room," Holt said. They left without comment. Holt pulled out a chair across the table and gestured toward it. Maya sat. Titan positioned himself beside her chair as though he'd done it 1,000 times, which, she thought, was because he had, or something close enough to it. Holt sat across from her. He folded his hands on the table. He had the kind of stillness that came from training, not temperament, the specific stillness of a man who had learned to wait as a professional skill. "Tell me," he said. Maya looked at her hands. She'd had this conversation before, or versions of it. The conversation where she tried to explain something complicated to someone who had already decided what she was, and the words came out fractured and slow, and the person across from her made adjustments, visible adjustments, to their patience. The performance of listening while actually waiting for her to finish. She looked up at Holt. "3 years ago," she said, I worked for the Federal K9 Recovery and Rehabilitation Program out of Fort Calvert." She paused, controlled her breathing the way she'd learned. "I was a trauma specialist for the dogs." Holt's expression didn't change, but something shifted underneath it. "Fort Calvert," he repeated. The unit at that facility included dogs pulled from active deployment after combat trauma. Some of them had lost handlers. Some had injuries. Most of them had both. She kept her eyes on him. The standard protocol at the time was behavioral retraining, force-based, fast cycle. "I know the protocol. It wasn't working," she said simply. The washout rate was over 60%. Dogs that had been functional in the field were being assessed as unrecoverable and removed from service. Holt was quiet. "I developed a different approach," Maya said. "Slower, trauma-informed, no force-based correction during the initial stabilization period. Gradual reintroduction to handler contact. The dogs I worked with, it took longer, but the long-term outcomes were different." She glanced at Titan, who had not moved from beside her chair. "Titan came to me 11 weeks into my rotation," she said. "He'd lost his handler in the field, wouldn't eat, wouldn't engage. Standard protocol had already flagged him for removal." She paused. "It took 4 months, but he came back." Holt's jaw had tightened slightly, not with anger, with the specific tension of a man processing information that was rearranging something he thought he already understood. "What happened?" he asked. "Why did you leave the program?" Maya looked at the table. Here was the part she had not told people, partly because telling it required more words than her stutter permitted to land cleanly, and partly because the version of events that had followed her departure was not the version she had lived. "There was a dog in the late cycle rotation," she said, "a shepherd named Keller. He'd been fast-tracked through assessment. Politically, there was pressure to return dogs to active status quickly. Budget concerns." She kept her voice level. "I flagged Keller as not deployment ready. I submitted documentation. I said he hadn't completed stabilization and that redeployment under those conditions would risk him and his handler." Holt said nothing. "The program director disagreed," Maya said. "He said I was being overly cautious. He said my documentation was subjective." She paused. "He also said that a specialist who couldn't communicate clearly in a briefing probably couldn't assess risk clearly either." The conference room was very quiet. "Keller was deployed 6 weeks after I raised the flag," Maya said. "The mission had complications. Keller's handler was injured." She stopped. "Nobody died, but the outcome was what I'd said it would be." Holt put both hands flat on the table. "And you left the program." They made it easier for me to leave than to stay." She said it without bitterness. It had taken her a long time to say it without bitterness, but she'd put in the work. "I left. I got my nursing license. I came here." She looked at him. "The dogs remember me," she said, "because I spent months earning the right to be remembered. That's all." Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Titan. The dog was sitting with the calm, settled attention of an animal that had made its assessment and arrived at its conclusion and saw no reason to revisit the question. "Ms. Whitmore," Holt said slowly, "the recovery methodology used by our current unit, the one we're exercising with today, was revised approximately 2.5 years ago. The new protocol emphasized trauma-informed approaches, gradual reintroduction, non-force-based stabilization." He paused. "They called it the adaptable recovery framework." Maya said nothing. "I know where it came from," Holt said. "I just didn't know the name that went with it." Something passed across Maya's face that she didn't try to control. Not triumph, not relief. Something older than either of those things. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who has the specific information required to see you. She was about to respond when the radio on the table crackled. One of Holt's agents' voice clipped. "Commander, Titan's secondary unit is reacting. East corridor, 3rd floor. You need to see this." Holt was already standing. Titan was already at the door. Maya followed them both back to the elevator, back to the 3rd floor, and when the doors opened, she saw it immediately. 4 of the K9s who had remained on the floor were clustered near the entrance to the east wing. Not aggressive, but locked in the particular posture she had learned to read years before the nurses on this floor had ever heard her stutter. Ears forward, weight forward, eyes fixed at a single point, not on a person, on a door. The door to the supply corridor that ran parallel to the post-surgical ward, the corridor that Maya knew from her years at Cedar Ridge, connected via a service passage to the restricted access hallway outside the Federal Witness Wing on the 4th floor. Maya looked at the door, looked at the dogs, felt the hair rise on her forearms with the slow, certain knowledge of someone who understood what an animal looked like when it had found something that should not be there. "Commander," she said quietly. Holt was already on his radio, but Maya was already walking toward the door because she had spent enough years learning to read the warnings that everyone else in the room had already decided to ignore, and she was not going to do that again. Her hand was 6 inches from the handle when the sound came from the other side. Not loud, not dramatic, the specific sound of a footstep trying very hard not to be a footstep. And every K9 in the corridor went rigid at exactly the same moment. Holt caught her arm before her hand reached the handle. Not rough, just firm. The grip of someone who had spent a long time making fast decisions in tight spaces and had learned that the first person through an unknown door is not always the right person. "Step back," he said quietly. No command edge this time. A different register entirely. Maya stepped back. Holt keyed his radio. "Brennan, East Corridor, 3rd floor, supply access door. Possible contact. I need 2 agents now. Non-announced approach." He released the radio and looked at the dogs. All 4 were still locked on the door, still silent, still carrying that specific weight-forward stillness that Maya had learned to read as certainty rather than suspicion. Animals didn't speculate. They didn't construct possibilities. When they looked at something like that, it was because something was there. She moved back toward the nurses' station without being asked, pulling far enough away to be clear of the approach corridor while staying close enough to watch. Marcus Webb was still on the floor. He'd positioned himself near the station with his arms folded and a look on his face that had been cycling through several versions of itself since the dogs had first arrived. Skepticism, confusion, something that might have been concern, now settling back into skepticism because that was the most comfortable place for it to land. "What's happening?" he asked, directed at nobody in particular. Priya appeared from behind him. She looked at the dogs, at the door, at Maya standing near the wall. "Maya, do you know what's going on?" Not yet," Maya said. 2 federal agents came out of the stairwell at a pace that looked like walking until you watched how they were moving. Low center of gravity, hands free, eyes already on the door. They exchanged a look with Holt. He made a small gesture. One took the near side of the door, the other positioned further back. The handle turned from the inside. What came through the door was a man in gray coveralls with a Cedar Ridge Facilities Management badge clipped to his breast pocket. He was carrying a toolbox. He was perhaps 45, medium height, with close-cut hair and the deliberate, unhurried movements of someone who had rehearsed looking ordinary. He got 3 steps into the corridor before he registered the agents and stopped. "Whoa! Hey!" He raised one hand, the other still holding the toolbox. "I'm maintenance. Work order for the HVAC unit in the East Service Corridor." He reached for his badge. "I've got my credentials right here. Keep your hands where I can see them," the nearer agent said. His voice was flat and unhurried, which was somehow more alarming than raised. "Both hands." The man put both hands up. The toolbox hit the floor. The sound of it wasn't quite right, too heavy for the tools visible on top, the weight distributed wrong, and Maya registered that in the same moment that Titan, who had moved to her left without her noticing, let out a single low sound that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a growl. Something in between. A signal. Holt was already moving toward the man. "ID, slowly." "It's right there on my badge. I work here. I'm just doing a work order." "The badge is compromised," Holt said, not to the man but into his radio. He looked at the credentials for less than 2 seconds before making that call. "Run facility employee verification on a badge number." He read it off. "And get me a confirmed work order for East Corridor HVAC, 3rd floor, today's date. Now." The man in the coveralls looked at the dogs. Something in his expression changed. Not panic exactly, but the specific recalibration of someone whose contingency plan had just encountered a problem it hadn't accounted for. "The toolbox," Maya said quietly. Holt looked at her. "The weight is off," she said. "When it hit the floor. Something's in there that isn't tools." The second agent had already crouched beside the toolbox. He didn't open it, just rested a hand lightly on the side, feeling for the heat signature of electronics, the density of compressed material. He looked up at Holt and gave a small, deliberate nod. "On your knees," Holt told the man in the coveralls. "Now." The man complied. He was still trying to look confused, but the performance had developed cracks. His breathing had changed. His eyes kept moving to the stairwell at the end of the corridor, to the elevator bank, to the door he'd come through, the specific eye movement of someone calculating exits. From somewhere below, Maya heard radio traffic escalating. More agents directed to the East Corridor. Within 90 seconds, there were 6 federal personnel in the hallway, and the man in the coveralls was no longer calculating exits because there weren't any. Linda Ferris appeared at the stairwell door and stopped so abruptly she had to catch herself on the frame. She looked at the man on his knees, looked at the agents, looked at Maya standing near the wall with Titan at her side and her hands in her pockets because she hadn't known what else to do with them. "What in the— Ma'am, I need you to move the remaining patients away from the east-facing rooms," Holt said without looking at her. "Non-emergency, slow and quiet. Get your staff doing that now." Linda looked at Maya. Maya nodded. That seemed to be enough. Linda disappeared back through the stairwell door, and Maya heard her voice rising on the other side, controlled and carrying, the voice of someone who ran a floor and knew how to use that authority. The radio on Holt's belt crackled. The voice on the other end was short and clipped. "Commander, badge number comes back as terminated employee. Cedric Vane, dismissed 6 months ago, Facilities Department." A pause. "No work order on record for that corridor today." The man on his knees, Cedric Vane, or someone using what was left of Cedric Vane's credentials, had stopped performing confusion. His face had gone flat and still in the way faces go when the calculation is over and there's nothing left to calculate. "There's a witness on the 4th floor," Maya said. She said it quietly, to Holt, not to the room. The service passage from that corridor connects to the restricted access hallway outside the Federal Witness Wing. Holt looked at her sharply. "I've worked this floor for 2 years, she said. I know the layout." He was already on the radio. "Get me eyes on the 4th floor witness corridor, now. And I want the witness in lockdown status until I personally clear that hallway." He didn't wait for the acknowledgement. He turned back to the man on the floor. "Who sent you here?" Vane said nothing. "That's fine," Holt said. He sounded almost tired. We have the toolbox, we have the credentials, we have a camera system that has been recording this corridor for the last 4 minutes. He crouched down to eye level. Who you're working for? That part will work out. It always works out. But right now I'm more interested in whether this was the only approach. Vane looked at the floor. One of the agents opened the toolbox. The visible layer of tools came off in a tray, and beneath it was a compact transmitter and what looked like a laminated hospital access card with an RFID chip, the kind used for restricted floor access. It wasn't the weapon Maya had half expected. It was in some ways more alarming. This had been a reconnaissance operation, not an assault. Someone had sent Vane in here not to do something today, but to confirm something, to map access, to set up the next step. The thought landed in her chest like something cold. He wasn't here to hurt anyone today, she said. Holt stood. He looked at her, and she could see in his face that he'd arrived at the same conclusion 10 seconds before she had. No, he said. He was here to make sure the 4th floor could be accessed. Next time. Holt said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. Vane was escorted to the stairwell. 2 agents went with him. 2 more remained in the east corridor. Holt stood in the middle of the hallway for a moment with the particular stillness of a man running through the sequence of what had just happened and what it meant for everything that came after. Then he looked at Maya. The dogs found him, he said. They found the corridor, she said. I noticed the weight of the T toolbox. After the dogs flagged the door. She didn't argue with that. It was true. Holt rubbed the back of his neck. Not a composed gesture, a tired one, the gesture of a man who was recalculating a morning that had gone considerably sideways from his operational plan. Ms. Whitmore, he said, walk me through the hospital layout. 4th floor access, service passages, any other entry points to the witness corridor that aren't on the standard floor plan. I don't have clearance for the 4th floor. I'm giving you clearance. She looked at him. Right now, he said, in this hallway, verbally, documented in my report. Walk me through it. So she did. They spent 20 minutes in the corridor and then another 20 in the stairwell, Maya walking Holt through every service access point she knew, the HVAC connections between floors, the supply elevator that bypassed the standard checkpoint if you had a maintenance credential, the corridor junction on the 2nd floor where 2 wings met in a way that the official floor plan represented as a dead end but wasn't. She'd learned all of it the way she'd learned most things at Cedar Ridge, by showing up early and staying quiet and watching how the building breathed. Holt asked precise questions. He didn't interrupt her stutter. He didn't fill in her words when she paused to find them, and he didn't do the thing that a lot of people did. The slight lean forward, the encouraging expression, that felt less like patience and more like pressure. He just waited. Let the information arrive in the shape it arrived in, and then used it. She found herself recalibrating him as they went. Her initial read had been Federal command, competent, the kind of professional certainty that sometimes blurred into the kind of certainty that got people hurt. But he'd listened to her about the toolbox. He'd listened to the dogs. He was listening now, taking notes on a phone she hadn't seen him pull out, asking follow-up questions that showed he'd actually processed what she'd said rather than waiting for the parts he'd already expected to hear. He was, she thought, genuinely good at his job, which was rarer than it should be. When they were done, he stood at the 2nd floor stairwell landing and looked at his notes and said, "The HVAC connection to 3 from 4. That's not in any of our pre-exercise facility documents." "It's not in the facility documents at all," Maya said. "It was put in during a renovation 4 years ago. The contractor who did it used a different sub than the one on the original plan, and the updated schematic was filed with facilities but never made it to the public-facing floor plan." Holt stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I asked," she said. "There was a period when the HVAC on 3 was running warm. I wanted to understand why." He looked at her for a long moment. "You just asked." "I asked the facilities manager. He told me." She paused. "People tell you things when you're not a threat to them." Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. Not quite respect, or maybe it was respect, but the version of it that arrives when someone has underestimated a situation and then had the honesty to notice. "Okay," he said. "I need to get this to my technical team." He paused at the landing. "Will you be available for a formal debrief this afternoon, on site?" Maya thought about Mr. Garfield on the third floor, who had 3 medications due at 2 o'clock. She thought about the post-surgical patient in 316 who'd had a restless night and would probably need her IV line checked. She thought about all the ordinary, unglamorous work of the floor she'd been pulled from since 9:53 in the morning. "I have patience," she said. "I know." He said it without dismissal. "Is there someone who can cover?" She thought about Linda Ferris's expression in the stairwell door, the shift from incomprehension to attention. "Maybe," she said. "I'll have someone confirm with your charge nurse." He started down the stairs, then stopped. "Miss Whitmore." He said it without turning around. "The Adaptable Recovery Framework, the recovery methodology. It has a citation attached to it in our unit documentation. The citation says methodology developed from internal Fort Calvin research. Author unspecified." He paused. "I'd like to correct that." He went down the stairs before she could respond. Maya stood on the landing for a moment. Titan had followed them through the entire building and was sitting beside her now with the patient, unhurried quality of a dog that has nowhere else to be. She looked down at him. His ears were up, his eyes soft, his breathing slow. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Me too." She went back to her floor. Linda was at the nurse's station when Maya came through the stairwell door. The floor had been redistributed. 2 patients moved to rooms on the west side. A third, whose condition didn't allow for movement, transferred to monitoring in place. Marcus had done most of the moving, which surprised her, until she noticed that Linda was the one who had assigned him to it, and that Linda had the expression of a woman who had reorganized her morning around a situation she still didn't fully understand and was not going to admit that until she did. "You okay?" Linda asked. Maya considered the question. Her feet hurt. She'd been on them for 6 hours without a real break. The stutter had cost her 3 or 4 extra seconds in every exchange, and she'd just spent 40 minutes walking a federal commander through her 2 years of informal facility knowledge in a stairwell. "I'm fine," she said. Linda studied her. "The federal commander? You know him?" "No, I didn't know him before today." "But the dogs?" Linda kept her voice neutral, which was a deliberate choice. Maya had worked with her long enough to recognize the difference between Linda's natural speaking voice and Linda's careful voice. "That's a longer conversation," Maya said. "I have time." Maya looked at the floor, looked at the remaining patients, looked at the clock on the wall, which said 12:14 p.m., which meant she was already 45 minutes past the point where she should have done rounds. "I'll tell you after shift," she said. Linda looked like she wanted to push, but didn't. "Go check on Garfield," she said instead. "He's been asking for you." Maya almost smiled. "Is he being difficult?" "He's being himself." Linda turned back to the station, which amounts to the same thing. Room 318 smelled like the particular combination of antiseptic and cafeteria lunch that distinguished every post-surgical recovery room Maya had ever worked in. Mr. Garfield was sitting up in bed with a crossword puzzle magazine, which he lowered when she came in. "There she is," he said. "Mr. Garfield." Maya moved to his IV line and began checking it, efficient and quiet. "I heard some kind of commotion out there. Big dogs, federal people." "There was an exercise," she said. "Exercise." He said it the way people said things when they weren't quite believing the explanation but weren't willing to push for the full story. He watched her work. "You were part of it." "Peripherally." He was quiet for a moment. "The nurse's aide who brought my lunch said some of the dogs followed you specifically, like they knew you." Maya adjusted the drip rate and made a note on his chart. "How's the pain level?" "A 4? He paused. "Maybe a 5. I don't like those numbers. It should be trending down from this morning. If it's not, I'll talk to the attending about your medication schedule. I want the surgeon. I'll put a note in." He was still watching her. "The dogs," he said again. "Did they know you?" She looked up from the chart. Garfield was 71 years old and had the eyes of a man who had spent a long career reading people across a desk, whatever that career had been. He wasn't asking the way the nurses at the station asked. He wasn't asking from curiosity or from the ambient noise of hospital gossip. He was asking because he had looked at her and actually wanted to know. "Yes," she said. "They knew me." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said, as if that settled something. He went back to his crossword. Maya finished her rounds. She checked the 316 patient, updated 3 charts, fielded a question from a patient's daughter about discharge timing, and managed not to speak to Marcus Webb, which required some deliberate navigation but was achievable. He'd been looking at her differently since the morning, not with the comfortable dismissiveness she'd learned to move around like furniture, but with something more unsettled, something that hadn't quite found its shape yet. She didn't have the energy to figure out what he was going to do with that. She had enough to manage. At 1:30, one of Holt's agents appeared at the third-floor nurses' station. Young, female, with the pressed efficiency of someone who had been briefing people through complicated situations for long enough that it had become its own kind of fluency. She spoke briefly with Linda, handed her a printed form, and then came to find Maya. "Commander Holt is ready for the debrief," she said. "Your charge nurse has cleared your patient load for the next 90 minutes. One of the agency medical liaisons will do your rounds." Maya looked at Linda, who gave her a small nod that said, "I handled it. Go." She went. The debrief happened in a different room than the morning conference. A smaller space on the first floor near the administrative offices, with a recorder on the table and 2 agents in addition to Holt. One of the agents she recognized from the corridor. The other was new, older, with silver in his hair and reading glasses perched on top of his head that he kept forgetting and then reaching for. He was introduced as Special Agent Tomas Wickfield, and he had the specific energy of someone who was technically present for the debrief, but was also simultaneously reading a report on his phone and composing his next 3 emails in his head. He looked up when Maya sat down. He looked at Holt. Something passed between them that Maya didn't quite catch. "Ms. Whitmore," Wickfield said. He had a voice that had probably been described as smooth at various points in his career. "I understand you've been very helpful this morning." "I tried to be." "Commander Holt has given me a summary of your background, your time at Fort Calvern." He set his phone face down on the table. "Can I ask what prompted you to leave the recovery program when you did, rather than pursuing a formal complaint about the Keller deployment?" Maya looked at him. She'd been in rooms before where a question arrived with luggage, where the question itself was almost beside the point, and what mattered was what came attached to it. This question had luggage. "I submitted documentation," she said. "It was reviewed and dismissed. The grounds given were that my communication style made it difficult to assess the reliability of my risk evaluation." She kept her voice even. "I didn't pursue a formal complaint because the formal complaint process would have required me to argue, in writing and in person, that my assessment was reliable in a system that had already documented its conclusion that it wasn't." Wickfield looked at her over his glasses. "That sounds like an assessment of the situation, not an explanation of why you left." "I left," Maya said, "because staying would have required me to keep making recommendations that would keep being dismissed, and I'd already watched Keller get deployed." She paused. "There's a point where staying becomes complicity." The room was quiet. Wickfield looked at Holt again, and this time Maya caught the edge of it. The look that meant they'd discussed something before she came in, and what she'd just said intersected with that prior conversation in a way that had shifted the room's weight. "Ms. Whitmore," Holt said. He leaned forward slightly. "The investigation into the Keller deployment. Are you aware that it was reopened?" She stared at him. 14 months ago, he said. "The program director at Fort Calvern, Director Reeves, was placed under an internal review, partly related to the Keller incident, partly related to a pattern of documentation practices that came to light during an unrelated audit." Maya said nothing. The word pattern was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "Your Fort Calvern file was part of that review," Wickfield said. His voice had changed. The smoothness was still there, but the performance had dropped out of it. He was talking to her directly now, not managing her, Your submitted documentation on Keller was reevaluated by an independent panel. The original dismissal was overturned. Maya's hands were very still in her lap. She was aware of that with one part of her brain, while the rest of it was trying to process what he'd just said, to run it through the sequence of what she knew and what she'd assumed and what she'd spent 3 years building an entire life on top of, and then, from somewhere else in the building, cutting through the quiet of the administrative corridor like a physical thing, the sound of an alarm. Not the standard patient alert tone, not a code. The distinctive 3-pulse sequence that Cedar Ridge used for one thing and one thing only. Security breach. Holt was on his feet before the second pulse finished, radio already up. Report. What floor? The answer came back, and Maya watched his face, and the thing she saw there was not what she expected. It wasn't alarm, or the controlled urgency of a commander activating a response. It was something more specific than that. It was the expression of a man who had just realized that Cedric Vane had not in fact been alone. The 3-pulse alarm cycled twice and went silent, which was somehow worse than if it had kept going. Holt's radio gave up the floor number in the same flat, clipped tone the agents used for everything, and Maya heard it clearly. 4th floor, witness wing. And then, a half-second behind it, a second voice cutting across the first. We have a medical situation. 4th floor, room 412, requesting immediate medical response. Holt was already moving toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at Wickfield. Something passed between them. A decision made in under 2 seconds the way people who had worked together for a long time made decisions. Wickfield stood, straightened his jacket, picked up his phone. I need medical personnel, Holt said. He wasn't looking at Wickfield. He was looking at Maya. I'm not cleared for the 4th floor, she said. She'd said it before. She said it again because it was true, and because someone needed to say the true thing when everything was moving this fast. I cleared you this morning, verbally. It's documented. He held the door. Are you coming? She was already standing. The 4th floor had a different texture than the floors below it. Maya registered that in the first 10 seconds, the heavier doors, the camera housing above every junction, the absence of the ambient noise that lived in a working hospital ward. Up here, the air was quieter, and the quiet had weight. There were 2 agents stationed at the entry checkpoint, and they waved Holt through without a word and looked at Maya for exactly 1 second before waving her through too, which told her that Holt had in fact documented his verbal clearance, because that was the kind of man he appeared to be. Room 412 was at the end of the protected corridor, and there was already a federal medical liaison outside it, a young man named, according to his badge, Specialist Dane Okafor, who had the expression of someone who had been managing a situation for the last 4 minutes that was slightly outside his training envelope. What do we have? Holt said. The witness. Mr. Harlan. Okafor glanced at Maya, then back to Holt. He's 63, hypertensive, history of cardiac arrhythmia. When the alarm sounded, he experienced what looks like a stress-triggered episode. Elevated heart rate, chest discomfort, some confusion. I've got him on a monitor, but his rhythm is... He stopped. It's not clean. Has he been assessed? Maya asked. Okafor looked at her. He hadn't expected her to speak, she could tell. Or maybe he'd expected her to ask differently, slower, with more obvious effort. I've done an initial assessment, he said. But I'm trained for emergency stabilization, not... What does his rhythm look like? She said. He pulled up a reading on the tablet in his hand and turned it toward her. She looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. The pattern was irregular, the QRS complex showing the kind of variability that could mean several things, none of them things you sat on. Is there a seat crash cart on this floor? She asked Holt. Yes. Get it to the room. She moved toward the door. And I need the full medication list from his intake file. Everything he's currently on. Someone has to pull that now. Okafor started to say something. Now, she said, not loudly. She didn't need loud. She pushed through the door. The room was a private room configured for a long-term protective custody patient. More furniture than a standard hospital room. A window with reinforced glass overlooking the parking structure. The particular lived-in quality of a space that had been someone's entire world for several weeks. The man in the bed was named Harlan, according to the door, and he was gray-faced and sweating, sitting partly upright with his hand pressed to the center of his chest and his breathing too shallow and too fast. He looked at Maya when she came in. He was scared, and he was trying not to look scared, and the combination had given him a rigid, compressed quality, like a man holding himself very still because he was afraid that moving would make something worse. "Mr. Harlan," she said. She moved to the right side of the bed and picked up his wrist, finding the pulse with 2 fingers. "I'm Maya. I'm a nurse. I need you to try and slow your breathing down for me. Can you do that?" "What's—" He stopped. His voice was thin. "What's happening out there?" "There was a security situation. It's being handled." His pulse was 134 and irregular. She kept her voice even. "Right now I need you to focus on me. You're having a cardiac episode. It's not a heart attack. Your color is still good, and you're alert. But your heart is working too hard, and we need to bring that down." He looked at her. "You sure?" "I'm working on being sure," she said honestly, "which is why I need the medication list." Okafor came through the door behind her with the tablet showing the intake records. She scanned it quickly. Metoprolol, lisinopril, a blood thinner, and a calcium channel blocker. She looked at the IV line in his arm, which Okafor had placed, and then at the monitor screen. "How long has the rhythm been like this?" she asked without looking up. "I noticed it about 6 minutes ago," Okafor said. "Before the alarm. His rate was elevated before the alarm," she said. Not an accusation. A fact. He was already in pre-episode when the alarm sounded. "Yes." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, running the timeline. A man already under physiological stress, already with elevated rate, hit with a security alarm designed to signal imminent threat. The stress response would have done the rest. The crash cart came through the door pushed by one of Holt's agents, who clearly had emergency training because he positioned it correctly without being told, and then stepped back and stayed out of the way, which put him ahead of a lot of people she'd worked with. "Mr. Harlan," she turned back to the patient. "I'm going to give you something through your IV that's going to help your heart slow down. It might make you feel a little strange for a minute. Some people get a flushing sensation, or a feeling like your chest dropped. It'll pass. I need you to stay as still as you can and keep breathing." "Okay," he said. He was looking at her the way people looked at the one person in the room they'd decided to trust, which was a weight she'd carried before and had learned to carry without letting it show. She calculated the dosage against his body weight and the calcium channel blocker already in his system. The interaction risk was manageable but real. She loaded the syringe, checked it again, and administered it at the rate she wanted. Not the rate that looked decisive, the rate that was actually right. Then she waited. Okafor stood beside the monitor. Holt stood in the doorway. The room was very quiet except for Harlan's breathing and the soft, continuous sound of the monitor. 40 seconds. 50. The rate on the monitor began to drop. Not cleanly, not all at once, but the way a tide goes out, gradually, with the rhythm beginning to organize itself into something more coherent. Harlan exhaled. A real exhale. The kind that came from the chest releasing, rather than being held. "There," Maya said. She checked his pulse again. 96 and still irregular but meaningfully better. "Stay with me. We're going to watch this for a few minutes." "Thank you," Harlan said. His voice had come back from wherever it had been. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I still need to make sure you stay in that window." She kept her eyes on the monitor and her hand on his wrist and her attention on the room, and after another 90 seconds she was reasonably confident the episode had been broken. Not over, she'd want a cardiologist involved, ideally in the next 2 hours, but broken. Okafor looked at her. He was trying to figure out how to say something. "Just say it," she told him without taking her eyes off the monitor. "I should have caught the pre-episode elevation before the alarm went off," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you placed the IV correctly, and you pulled the medication list, and you got the crash cart here. So let's call it even and do better next time." He nodded. He looked like someone who'd been braced for something harder and hadn't received it. Holt came fully into the room now. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Harlan, who looked back at him with the expression of a man who had spent several weeks under protective custody, developing opinions about the people responsible for him. "You get the guy?" Harlan asked. "We got one," Holt said. "We're working on the rest." The rest. Harlan's voice had gone flat. So there's a rest. That's what we're determining. Harlan looked at the ceiling. I have been in this room for 31 days, he said. I have eaten food from this floor, watched television from this room, and had conversations with exactly 4 people on a regular basis, 3 of whom work for you. He paused. If there's a rest, I'd like to know how they knew I was here. The room was quiet. Maya looked at Holt. His jaw had the tight, controlled set of a man holding something back, and she recognized the shape of what he was holding, the specific tension of someone who didn't yet have an answer to a question that needed one badly. She went back to monitoring the patient. Outside, in the corridor, she could hear the radio traffic picking up again. More agents, more communication, the particular overlapping quality of a security apparatus activating across multiple floors simultaneously. It occurred to her, not for the first time that day, that Cedar Ridge Federal Medical Center was both more complicated and more compromised than most of the people working in it had understood when the morning started. After another 15 minutes, she was comfortable leaving Harlan under Okafor's monitoring with strict instructions and clear criteria for re-escalation. She wrote those instructions in detail on the tablet record, because detail mattered, and because she'd learned not to assume that verbal instructions survived the gap between speaking and remembering. In the corridor, Holt was on the phone. Not the radio, his phone, the personal one, and speaking in a tone that was low and carrying the specific controlled intensity of someone talking to someone above them in a chain of command about something that had gone wrong. He finished the call and stood for a moment with the phone in his hand before putting it away. The witness is stable, Maya said. Good. He didn't sound as relieved as she'd expected. He sounded like a man for whom one problem being resolved had just freed him to fully focus on 3 others. What happened? She asked. He looked at the corridor, looked at her, looked like he was making a decision. Vane wasn't freelancing, he said. The transmitter in the toolbox, our tech team says it's the type used to clone RFID access cards. He wasn't here to map the floor plan. He already had the floor plan. He was here to copy a credential that would get someone onto this floor. He paused. We think he copied it, before we intercepted him. The cold feeling from before came back, which means someone could already have a working credential for the 4th floor. Yes, and the second breach alarm was an access attempt. 4th floor secondary entrance. Card was rejected. We'd already updated the credential system, but not fast enough. Someone tried it within 11 minutes of Vane being detained. 11 minutes. Someone had been waiting that close, watching, ready to move the moment Vane completed his part. This wasn't improvised. This was coordinated, and it had been planned around a specific window. Who's the witness? Maya asked. Holt looked at her. I'm not asking for details, she said. I'm asking whether the threat level is high enough that stable but watched isn't enough. Because if someone just tried to get onto this floor 11 minutes after their first person was caught, they're not deterred. They're adjusting. Holt's expression shifted. You have a point. The cardiac episode, if Mr. Harlan has another one, or if this floor goes into active security response again, the physiological stress is going to complicate his management. He needs to be moved. Moving him creates its own risk. Leaving him here with a compromised credential on record and an active exterior team creates more. She held his gaze. I know I'm not a security consultant, but I've been in this building for 2 years, and I understand how these floors connect, and I understand what happened to that patient's heart rate when the alarm went off. She paused. Move him somewhere they don't know he is. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to make a call. Make it. He went 3 steps down the corridor and put the phone to his ear. Maya leaned against the wall and looked at the closed door of room 412, and thought about the Keller mission, which she hadn't thought about in months, and about Titan sitting beside her chair in the conference room like a fixed point, and about Wickfield saying the original dismissal was overturned, and she tried to put all of those things in order and couldn't quite manage it yet. Holt came back. We're moving him in 40 minutes. Secondary location, undisclosed. I need the transfer to be medically managed. Who do you have for that? Okafor. He's not enough alone. I know. He looked at her steadily. I know you have patients on your floor. Linda has it covered, Maya said, which was a presumption, but she was reasonably confident it was a correct one. Tell me what the transfer looks like. They worked through it in the corridor. The route, the equipment that would travel with Harlan, the monitoring requirements, the criteria that would trigger a stop and stabilize rather than continuing to the secondary location. Okafor joined them and listened carefully and did not interrupt, which Maya noted. It was during this conversation, partway through a discussion about IV continuity during transport, that Holt's radio went live again. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard before. A woman, tight, clipped, with the specific quality of someone delivering information she'd verified once and was delivering exactly once. Commander Holt, we've completed the forensic pass on the toolbox transmitter. Manufacturer trace came back. The transmitter was purchased from a vendor in a batch of 12 units. We've tracked the purchase to a shell entity registered in this state 18 months ago. A pause. The registered agent on the shell entity is a name you're going to want to sit down for. Holt said, Go ahead. The voice said the name. Maya didn't know the name. She watched Holt's face when he heard it, and that was enough. The color didn't drain from his face. He wasn't the kind of man who showed it that way. But something went very still behind his eyes. The stillness of someone for whom a suspicion they had not allowed themselves to fully form had just become a fact. And the fact was worse than the suspicion. Say again, he said. The voice repeated it. Holt took the radio from his ear and held it at his side for 2 seconds. Then he put it back up and said, Lock down the administrative floor, nobody in or out. Detain anyone who attempts to leave the building through any exit. And get Wickfield. I need Wickfield isolated from general communication until I get down there. Maya looked at him. Wickfield, she said. He didn't answer right away. He was already moving toward the stairwell, already recalculating, already running the sequence of what he knew and what it changed. But he stopped at the stairwell door and looked back at her. Stay with the patient, he said. Don't let anyone on this floor who isn't already cleared. If anything changes medically, you radio me directly. Not through the station, not through the floor agent. Me. He held out a secondary radio he pulled from his jacket pocket. This is a closed frequency. My team only. She took it. Holt, she said. He waited. Is Bizou Wickfield involved in this? The transmitter, the shell company? Holt looked at the stairwell door, looked at her. And in that half-second of silence, she understood that the investigation she'd been brought into the edge of this morning had turned a corner that nobody, not even the commander running it, had been fully prepared for. That's what I'm about to find out, he said. He went through the door. The stairwell closed behind him, and the corridor was quiet again. And Maya stood with the radio in her hand and thought about the specific kind of danger that didn't come at you loudly, that arrived instead in the shape of a man with reading glasses and a smooth voice who asked careful questions and sat in the right rooms and knew exactly what documents to sit across from. She thought about Wickfield's face when the name had come through on the radio. She hadn't been looking at Holt when it happened. She'd been looking at Wickfield's reflection in the reinforced window of room 412's door because she'd learned a long time ago that the most useful information in any room wasn't always in the direction people expected you to look. Wickfield had heard the voice on the radio. He'd been close enough. And what she had seen in that reflection was not the expression of a man receiving new information. It was the expression of a man recognizing a mistake. She went back into room 412. Harlan was resting, his rate holding at 91, his breathing slower and more even. Okafor stood beside the monitor doing exactly what she'd told him to do, which she appreciated. Any changes? She asked. Steady, Okafor said. He looked at the radio in her hand. What's happening out there? I don't fully know, she said, which was true. But we need to begin prep for transfer. 40 minutes. She moved to Harlan's bedside and began running through the checklist in her head. IV security, monitoring leads, portable unit charge status. The organized, methodical process of preparing a patient for movement under circumstances that were not ideal, in a building that had turned out to be less secure than anyone had planned for, carrying a radio on a closed frequency that connected her to a commander who was currently somewhere below her, trying to determine whether his own debrief partner had been working against him. She was halfway through the checklist when the lights went out. Not all of them. The emergency lighting engaged in under a second, the standard backup protocol that any hospital ran on, red-tinged, motion-activated, casting everything in the particular flat light that made familiar spaces look like somewhere else entirely. The monitor stayed live. It was on battery backup, and the beep of Harlan's heart rate in the near dark was oddly steadying. "What was that?" Harlan said. He was not panicking. He had the controlled alarm of a man who had been managing fear for 31 days and had developed a working relationship with it. "Power interruption," Maya said. She moved to the door and cracked it open. In the corridor, the emergency lights had activated along the ceiling, and the floor agent stationed at the corridor junction was already on his radio. She keyed her own radio. "Holt." Static. Then, "Whitmore, stay in position. We have a localized power interruption on 4 and 5. It's deliberate. They cut the secondary feeder to the upper floors. Main systems are on backup, but the credential reader on the 4th floor secondary entrance is offline, which meant the door it controlled was either locked failsafe or open failsafe, depending on how it had been configured. "Which way does the secondary entrance fail?" she asked. A pause that was a half-second too long. "I don't have that in front of me." She looked at Okafor. "Does Harlan's room lock from the inside?" Okafor went to the door and checked it. "Yes. Manual deadbolt." "Lock it," she said. She keyed the radio again. "Holt, the secondary entrance to this floor. I need to know if it fails open or locked. Someone cut the power to a specific floor. That's not random. They're trying to open a door." Holt's voice came back, and behind it she could hear the controlled urgency of his team beginning to move. "Working on it. Stay locked in that room." She looked at Harlan. He was watching her with the particular calm of a man who had made a decision to trust the person in front of him and was committed to that decision even now, even in the red-tinted emergency light, even with the monitor beeping steadily in the dark room. "You're doing great," she told him. She meant it. She went to the window and looked out at the parking structure below. The afternoon light was flat and gray. 3 vehicles she hadn't noticed before were parked near the structure's east stairwell, and as she watched, the door of the stairwell opened and a man in a gray jacket walked out, looked up, and looked directly at the 4th floor windows. He was too far away for her to see his face, but he held his position for 4 full seconds in a way that was not the way a person stood in a parking structure unless they were waiting to see something specific. She stepped back from the window. "Okafor," she said quietly. "How many people know the layout of this floor well enough to know which entrance the power cut would affect?" He looked at her. He'd gone pale. "Staff," he said. "Federal personnel. Anyone who'd been given a facility briefing." She thought about Wickfield's reflection in the window of room 412, about the expression of a man recognizing a mistake, about what kind of mistake required a power outage on the 4th floor to correct. Her radio crackled. "Holt, tight and fast. Whitmore, the secondary entrance fails open. Get the patient out of that room, now." She was already moving. "Okafor, disconnect the monitor leads. Leave the portable unit running. Clip it to the bed rail. We're moving him in the bed, not transferring. Fastest option." Maya was already at the door, pulling it open, scanning the corridor. The emergency lighting threw everything into that flat, red-tinged wash that made distances hard to read and shadows unreliable. The floor agent at the corridor junction, a young man named Reyes, whose name she'd caught from Holt's radio earlier, was already moving toward her. "Commander says evacuate the witness," Reyes said. "That's what we're doing." She looked both ways down the corridor. The secondary entrance was at the far east end. She could see the door, could see the indicator light above. It was dark. No green, no red. Just the absence of the credential reader doing anything at all. "Fails open." "Which way is the primary stairwell?" "West end, but it's 2 corridors and a junction." "Then that's the way we go." She went back into the room. Okafor had the monitor leads disconnected and clipped, had the IV line secured to a portable pole attached to the bed rail. He'd done it fast and he'd done it right. She noted that without saying it, there wasn't time. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "we're moving you. Stay flat, don't try to help us push. It'll throw the weight off. Just keep your hands in your lap and breathe." Harlan complied without argument. He'd stopped asking questions, which she read as a form of trust that cost him something, and she didn't waste it. They got the bed through the door in a single coordinated push. Okafor at the head, Maya on the right rail, Reyes holding the door. The corridor was clear. The secondary entrance at the east end remained dark, the door still closed. But Maya kept her eyes on it the way she kept her eyes on a patient's monitor when the numbers were on the edge of a range she didn't like, watching for the specific change that preceded the problem. They were halfway down the corridor when the secondary entrance opened, not fast, not with urgency. It opened the way a door opened when someone on the other side had been waiting and had decided that waiting was finished. A man came through, not in gray coveralls this time, not performing maintenance, a dark jacket, no badge visible, one hand at his side, moving with the particular economy of someone who'd trained for this and was operating inside that training. Reyes stepped in front of the bed. His hand went to his radio first, weapon second, which was the correct order for the situation, and cost him a second. He got the radio up and said, "Contact, 4th floor corridor, I need..." Before the man was close enough that the radio stopped being the priority. "Get the bed to the stairwell," Maya said to Okafor. She held Reyes's position in her peripheral vision and kept moving with the bed rail in her hand, because stopping the patient was not an option, and because she had assessed, in the way she'd learned to assess things quickly in environments where being wrong had consequences, that the man coming through the east door was alone. One person, one opening, one window. She heard Reyes behind her, a struggle that was brief and physical, and then a voice. Reyes's voice, clipped and pained. "Go, keep going." He'd gotten the man to the floor. She didn't look back because looking back would have meant slowing down, and slowing down would have meant losing the distance they'd already made. The primary stairwell door was ahead. She pushed through it with her shoulder and held it for Okafor in the bed, and then Reyes, who came through last with one hand pressed to his side and a controlled expression that meant something was hurt, but he'd decided it could wait. "Reyes, I'm fine." He got to the other side of the door and pressed his back against it. "There'll be more in the stairwell." "How many does Holt have positioned down there?" "2 agents on 3, 2 on 2. Should be." He was already on the radio again, fast and clipped, giving positions. The response came back fragmented by the stairwell acoustics. She caught Holt's voice, caught the word secure, caught a floor number. 2, Reyes said. "We go to 2. Agents will meet us." The stairwell descent with a hospital bed was not elegant. It required the kind of improvised physical problem-solving that didn't feature in any protocol she'd ever read. Tilting the frame, managing the wheels on the lip of each step, Okafor taking the head weight while she and Reyes managed the foot and the rail. The whole thing accompanied by Harlan's white-knuckled grip on his own blanket and his deliberate controlled breathing that she was monitoring with one part of her brain even while the rest of it was managing the descent. On the second-floor landing, 2 of Holt's agents were waiting. One of them took Reyes's position immediately, looked at his side, and said something quiet and specific that Maya didn't catch. Reyes answered in the same register. "Through the fire door," the agent said, and she didn't ask why the fire door instead of the main floor entrance because she'd been in this building for 2 years, and she knew that the fire door on 2 opened into a service corridor that connected to the staff parking structure and bypassed the main lobby entirely. And if someone had planned this operation well enough to cut the power to a specific floor and have a man waiting at the secondary entrance, the main lobby was probably not the safest route. They went through the fire door. The service corridor was fluorescent lit and narrow and smelled like industrial cleaning solution, and the bed just barely fit through it, which Maya noted with the detached observation of someone who had become very focused on the immediate problem and had temporarily suspended everything that wasn't the immediate problem. At the far end, a heavy steel door opened into the covered staff parking structure. A vehicle was waiting. Not an ambulance, a dark SUV with Federal plates, engine running. The transfer from bed to vehicle took 90 seconds of organized difficulty. Harlan did not complain. He didn't ask where they were taking him. He looked at Maya once, just before the vehicle door closed, with the expression of a man who wanted to say something and had decided it could wait. She stepped back as the SUV moved. The agents went with it. Okafor stayed. Reyes stayed, still pressing a hand to his side. "Holt," Maya said into the radio. "Witness is away," Holt said. She could hear him moving. "Good. Where are you?" Service corridor, second floor exit, staff P, parking structure. Stay there. A pause. We have the man from the fourth floor. Reyes, you okay? Reyes keyed his own radio. Bruised, maybe cracked. I'm functional. Good man. Whitmore, I need you back inside in 10 minutes. We're in the administrative wing. There are things happening that you should be present for. She looked at the parking structure, looked at the ordinary afternoon light coming through the open upper level of the structure. The gray sky above it, a pigeon moving along one of the concrete beams with complete indifference to the morning and afternoon they'd all just had. I'll be there, she said. She took 2 minutes before going back in. Not because she needed to compose herself, she'd had the kind of day that made composure irrelevant, but because she had learned a long time ago that the moments between one crisis and the next were the only moments available for honest accounting of what had actually happened, and she had a habit of taking them seriously. What she knew, Wickfield's name had appeared on a shell company registered 18 months ago. The company had purchased the transmitter used in today's operation. Wickfield had been inside the building, inside the debrief room, inside the command conversation for the entire exercise. He'd known which floor Harlan was on. He'd known the credential system. He'd known Holt's team and their positions and their communication protocols because he'd been in the room when all of it was discussed. And she'd seen his face in the reflection of a reinforced window when the transmitter trace came back. That expression wasn't guilt. It was the colder thing underneath guilt. The thing that came when someone calculated what their exposure was and started running the options. She went back inside. The administrative wing on the first floor had been transformed in the 40 minutes since the debrief room. The calm, operational quality of the morning setup was gone. There were 6 agents in the corridor, 2 more inside the room, and the conference table that had held laptops and maps this morning now held printed documents, evidence bags, and 2 phones in sealed plastic. The air in the room had the specific density of a space where something significant had already happened, and the documentation of it was underway. Holt was standing at the head of the table. Beside him, a woman Maya hadn't seen before. Early 40s, dark hair pulled back, federal credentials, and the specific posture of someone who outranked Holt and wanted him to know it without making a performance of it. She was introduced as Deputy Director Kara Sloan, and she looked at Maya with the evaluative attention of someone accustomed to assessing people quickly and accurately. Wickfield was not in the room. "Where is he?" Maya asked. "Detention room, building security office," Holt said. "He's been formally detained pending investigation." "He's not under arrest yet," Sloan said. She had a precise, flat voice. "We're working through the documentation chain. It takes time to do correctly." "Does he know about the shell company trace?" "He knows we have it." Sloan looked at her steadily. "Ms. Whitmore, Commander Holt has given me a full briefing on your involvement today. I have some questions." "Okay." "You observed Wickfield's reaction when the transmitter trace came back." "I saw his reflection in a window," Maya said. "I wasn't looking at him directly." "But you made an assessment based on what you saw." "I made an observation," Maya said. "I told Holt. He made the assessment." Sloan looked at Holt. "She's precise," she said, as if noting a feature. "Yes," Holt said. "Ms. Whitmore, your Fort Calvern file was part of the internal review that flagged Wickfield 18 months ago." Sloan said it without preamble, without building toward it, just the fact placed on the table. "Director Reeves, the program director who dismissed your documentation on the Keller deployment. Reeves and Wickfield have a documented professional relationship going back 12 years. When the audit of Reeves's documentation practices began, Wickfield was one of 3 senior personnel who had access to the review materials." Maya looked at the table. He knew the review was happening. He knew which files were being re-examined, including yours. Sloan put a document in front of her. A printed email chain, the addresses redacted, the content visible. "This is a communication pulled from Wickfield's secondary work account, 14 months ago. It references the Fort Calvern specialist and the status of the documentation review." She paused. "He was tracking it." Maya read the email. It was short and it was careful. The way communications were short and careful when the person writing them understood that brevity was cover. But the meaning underneath the careful language was not ambiguous. Wickfield had known her documentation was going to be vindicated. He'd known it before the independent panel issued its finding, and he'd taken no action. Not to restore her standing, not to correct Reeves, not to flag the conflict to anyone above him. He'd sat on it. Why? Maya said. Not a full question, just the word. Sloane sat down. For the first time, she looked less like a deputy director and more like a person who was tired and had been managing a complicated situation for longer than this morning. Reeves and Wickfield, she said, have been running a secondary operation for approximately 3 years, using the K9 program's budget allocation as cover. The shell company that purchased the transmitter is one of 4 entities we've now identified. They were moving money through contractor payments, equipment, training facilities, personnel. She paused. The K9 program was producing results that justified increasing budget allocation. The methodology that produced those results came from your work at Fort Calvern. If your documentation had been validated when you submitted it, the investigation into Reeves's practices would have started 3 years earlier. Wickfield needed that not to happen. The room was quiet for a moment. He protected Reeves, Maya said, to protect the operation. Yes. And the witness upstairs, Harlan, he's connected to this. Sloane looked at Holt. Harlan is a former contractor, Holt said. He was scheduled to testify next week about the budget discrepancies in the K9 program. His testimony would have named Reeves and would have led directly to Wickfield. He paused. Today wasn't random. This was timed to the testimony schedule. Maya sat back. She'd been standing for most of it and hadn't noticed until now. She pulled out the chair behind her and sat, and for a moment she just breathed, which was something she'd been doing in abbreviated form since approximately 9:53 a.m. The Keller deployment, she said, was that connected to this, or was Reeves just covering his practices when he dismissed my assessment? Holt and Sloane exchanged a look. Both, Holt said. Reeves had been cutting corners in the recovery program for budget reasons. Budget that was being siphoned. Fast-tracking dogs to deployment-inflated program output numbers. Higher output numbers justified higher allocation. Your flag on Keller was a threat to the fast-track process. He stopped. It wasn't personal, but the effect was the same. Maya thought about that. She'd told herself for 3 years that it hadn't been personal. She'd built a fairly stable structure out of that belief. Finding out it was true didn't make it better, exactly. It made it more specific, which was its own kind of thing to sit with. She set it aside. There was more to manage before she had the space to sit with anything. What happens now? She asked. Wickfield will be formally arrested once the documentation is complete, Sloane said. Reeves is already in federal custody. He was picked up this morning at his home, concurrent with the operation here. We had a parallel team running. She looked at Maya directly. Your documentation from Fort Calvern, the original flag on Keller, the methodology records, the dismissal. It's all going to be part of the evidentiary record. Your name will be in this. I know. Publicly, eventually. This will not be a quiet resolution. I understand. Sloane studied her for a moment. You don't seem surprised. I've had a long day, Maya said. I might be surprised later. Something moved across Sloane's face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't fully develop. Fair enough. She stood. I need to get back to the detention room. Commander Holt will stay with you for the debrief documentation. This will take several hours. She looked at Holt. Get her anything she needs, food, water, whatever. She's been on her feet since 7 this morning. She left. Holt went to the corner where the coffee setup from the morning was still running. Someone had refilled it during the crisis, which struck Maya as both absurd and deeply human, and brought back 2 cups. He put one in front of her and sat across the table. Garfield is going to be annoyed, Maya said. Holt looked at her. Patient on my floor. He was due medications at 2. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:47. It's almost 4. Linda Ferris has your floor. I know. He'll still be annoyed. Holt drank his coffee. It occurred to her that this was the first time she'd seen him do something ordinary. For what it's worth, he said, the man in the 4th floor corridor, the one who came through the secondary entrance, he's in custody. He's talking. People who've been on a failed operation tend to talk faster than people think they will. What's he saying? Enough. Holt set down his cup. The operation today was designed to look like an external threat to cover internal access. Vane clones the credential, passes it to the corridor man. The corridor man gets to Harlan before the testimony. Wickfield manages the internal response to keep his team from positioning correctly. But the dogs found Vane before he could pass the credential. Yes, Holt looked at her. Because of the dogs. And because you noticed the toolbox. She didn't say anything. Maya. He used her first name without apparent decision, just the way it came out. You understand that without you today, without what you did with the toolbox, without the building knowledge, without what you did for Harlan upstairs, the outcome of this morning looks completely different. The dogs found the door, she said. You read what the dogs were telling you. He leaned forward slightly. That's not a small thing. That's the specific thing. Nobody else on this floor was going to read that. She looked at her coffee cup. The D-dogs remember me. That's not a skill I can take credit for. That's just time and patience. Time and patience is absolutely a skill, Holt said. He sounded tired and certain in equal measure. It's the hardest one. The debrief documentation took the rest of the afternoon. 2 agents took her through the sequence of events from 9:53 to the transfer of Harlan, recording everything in the formal, methodical language of federal documentation that turned a chaotic day into a series of time-stamped decisions and outcomes. She answered every question completely. She didn't minimize her role, which had been her instinct, but she also didn't expand it beyond what had actually happened, which was a different kind of discipline. At one point, one of the agents asked her to describe what she had observed when she looked at Titan in the corridor of the 3rd floor, to describe specifically what she read in the dog's behavior that told her someone was on the other side of the supply corridor door. She thought about how to answer that for a moment. He shifted his weight forward, she said. His ears came forward and his nostrils were working. The specific active scent tracking pattern rather than the ambient scent processing pattern. His tail was elevated but not flagging. In a dog with his training profile, that configuration is target acquisition. He wasn't curious, he was certain. The agent wrote it down. He didn't ask her to clarify. He trusted that she knew what she was describing, which was, she reflected, a novelty. At 5:15, Linda Ferris appeared in the doorway of the conference room. She looked at the agents, looked at the documents on the table, looked at Maya, and said to nobody in particular, I need 5 minutes with my nurse. One of the agents looked at Holt. 5 minutes, Holt said. Linda came in and closed the door partway and sat in the chair nearest Maya and didn't say anything for a moment. Garfield got his medications, she said finally. He asked about you. What did you tell him? That you were in a meeting. Linda looked at the table. I watched the security footage from the 3rd floor corridor, the part they'd released to charge staff, the part where the dogs converged on you. She stopped. I have managed this floor for 7 years, Maya. I have worked with a lot of nurses. Maya waited. I didn't know, Linda said. It came out flat and honest, without performance. I didn't know any of it. What you did before you came here, what those dogs meant. She paused. I also didn't. I heard things, the way the other nurses talked about you. I should have said something. It's okay, Maya said. It's not. Linda said it simply, without argument, just placing it there. It's not okay. I want you to know that I know that. Maya looked at her. Linda Ferris was not a person who said things she didn't mean. That was one of the things Maya had always respected about her, even on the days when the silence Linda had maintained around how the floor treated her had felt like its own kind of weight. Thank you, Maya said. She meant it. Linda stood. When you're done here, whenever that is, tonight, tomorrow, you take tomorrow as personal time. Don't argue with me about it. I have patience. They will be here when you get back. Linda picked up her badge lanyard from where it had been resting on the table and put it back around her neck. Take the time. She left. At 6:30, the debrief concluded. The agents packed their materials, thanked her with the brisk efficiency of people moving to the next task. Holt walked her to the lobby, which had returned to its regular state. The K9 unit long gone, the federal exercise wrap-up completed, the facility settling back into its normal rhythms as though the morning had been a weather event that had passed. Titan was in the lobby. She stopped. The dog was with his handler, a young agent who looked exhausted and was clearly ready to wrap the day. And he'd been lying near the entrance with his head on his paws. But when Maya came through the door from the administrative corridor, he raised his head and watched her cross the lobby with the unhurried attention of an animal that had known she was coming before she got there. She crouched beside him. He pushed his head against her palm in the specific way he'd always pushed against her palm, the weight and angle of it unchanged from 3 years ago. "Hey," she said quietly. He exhaled. She stayed there for a moment, just her hand on the side of his head, the lobby traffic moving around them, the building transitioning into the quieter rhythms of evening. The weight of the day was catching up to her the way it always caught up. Not during, when there was too much to manage, but after, when the work was done and the body started sending invoices. She stood. Holt was waiting near the entrance. He handed her a card, physical card, printed, his direct number and a secondary number. "The investigation will require follow-up," he said. "Potentially several sessions over the next few weeks. I'll be in touch." "Okay." "And Maya." He stopped. The professional distance he'd carried all day was still there, but something underneath it had shifted slightly. What happened at Fort Calvern? The dismissal, the record, the independent panel's finding is going to be entered into the formal federal record as part of this investigation. Your assessment of Keller was correct. That's going to be documented, permanently and publicly. He paused. "I thought you should hear that plainly." She looked at him. "I knew I was right," she said. "I've always known that." "I know," he said. "That's not the same as having it acknowledged." She walked out of Cedar Ridge Federal Medical Center at 6:47 p.m., 12 hours to the minute from when she'd arrived. The parking lot was quiet, the evening air cooler than the morning, a light from the parking structure casting long shadows across the asphalt. She sat in her car for 3 minutes before starting it. Her phone had 17 notifications she hadn't looked at since morning. She scrolled through them without opening any of them. Texts from numbers she didn't recognize, which meant the story had started moving through channels she couldn't yet see. Somebody at Cedar Ridge had talked to somebody, the way somebody always talked to somebody, and the shape of what had happened today was starting to circulate in the form that stories circulated before anyone had the full version. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. She was pulling out of the parking lot when her phone buzzed again. She stopped at the exit and looked at it. A text from a number saved only as Fort Calvern. Internal review. A contact she'd saved 14 months ago after a single call from an unknown number that had asked her 3 careful questions and then gone quiet. The text said, "We need you to come in, not a request. Testimony scheduled. Monday. There are people you need to hear from and people who need to hear from you. There are people who need to hear from you." She sat at the parking lot exit with her signal blinking and the empty street ahead of her and read the text 3 more times. Monday was 4 days away. She put the car in drive and pulled onto the road, and she was already thinking about what she would say. Not the words, not yet, but the shape of what the words would need to hold. And for the first time in 3 years, the thing she was thinking about was not how to make herself smaller so the room would be comfortable, but how to take up exactly as much space as the truth required. Her phone buzzed 1 more time before she cleared the block. A different number. Unrecognized. The text was 2 lines only, and when she read it at the next red light, the ground shifted under her in a way she hadn't expected. It said, "My name is Lena Harlow. I was Keller's handler. I've been trying to find you for 14 months. I think it's time we talked." The light turned green and Maya didn't move. Behind her, a car waited 3 full seconds before tapping its horn. Not aggressively, just the reflexive tap of someone whose day had its own momentum and needed her to have hers. She pressed the accelerator and pulled through the intersection and read the text 1 more time in her peripheral memory, the words arranged exactly as she'd received them, and she drove the rest of the way home without the radio on. Lena Harlow, Keller's handler. She knew the name from the incident report, the version of the incident report she'd been allowed to see before she left the program, which was a partial version. names and unit identifiers redacted in the places that mattered most. She'd known there was a handler. She'd known the handler had been injured. She had not allowed herself to pursue that thread any further because there was a specific kind of damage that came from following threads that led only back to the place where you'd been dismissed, and she'd had enough of that for one lifetime. But the handler had apparently not stopped following. Maya sat at her kitchen table for an hour that evening with her phone face up in front of her and a cup of tea she'd made, and then ignored going cold beside it. She read the text 4 more times. She thought about what 14 months of looking for someone felt like from the inside, and then she thought about what 14 months of not knowing felt like from the other side. And then she picked up the phone and wrote back, "I'm here. When do you want to talk?" The response came in under a minute. "Tomorrow. I can come to you. Just tell me where." She gave her address. She went to bed. She did not sleep especially well, which she'd expected, and got up at 5:30 out of habit and made proper coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the early gray light and tried to organize what she knew and what it meant and what Monday's testimony would require of her. The thing about preparing testimony, she'd learned from the one time she'd done it before, the deposition that went nowhere 3 years ago, was that the preparation was mostly about deciding what to stop doing. Stop softening the edges. Stop anticipating the room's discomfort and adjusting for it in advance. Stop packaging the truth in the shape that would be easiest for other people to receive. The truth was the truth. It could hold its own shape. She made eggs. She ate them. She was rinsing the pan when the knock came at 8:15. Lena Harlow was in her mid-30s, taller than Maya had expected for no particular reason, with the posture of someone who'd been military and carried it in their spine in a way that didn't fully go away. She had short dark hair and a scar along her left forearm that disappeared into her sleeve, not hidden, just not offered. She stood on Maya's doorstep in jeans and a jacket and looked at Maya with the expression of someone who had been managing the anticipation of this moment for a long time and was now on the other side of it and didn't quite know what to do with that. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. "Maya," Maya said. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Maya put coffee in front of Lena Harlow, and Lena Harlow wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment before she spoke. "I was injured during the mission," she said. "Not seriously. My arm, some soft tissue damage, a week in medical. But Keller," she stopped. "He made it back. He was in rough shape. He was in a facility for 8 weeks and then he was retired. He lives with my sister now." She looked up. "He's fine. I want you to know that first." Maya exhaled something she hadn't known she'd been holding. "Okay," she said. "I didn't know about the flag you'd submitted on him," Lena said. "Not until the review started, 14 months ago. Someone from the Internal Audit Office contacted me as part of the investigation background. They told me there had been a risk assessment submitted before the deployment, identifying Keller as not ready." She set down her mug. "They told me it had been dismissed." She paused. "They told me the reason given for the dismissal was that the specialist communication difficulties made her risk evaluations unreliable." The kitchen was quiet. "I want you to know," Lena said carefully, "that when I found that out, I went to my unit commander the same day. I asked for the name of the specialist. They wouldn't give it to me. That's when I started looking." Maya looked at her hands. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "The mission." "I know." Lena's voice was steady, but the steadiness had work in it. "I know it wasn't mine. I'm here because I want you to know it wasn't yours either. You did what you were supposed to do. You saw something and you documented it and you said it clearly. I've read the report, Maya. I've read every word of it. And they made a decision based on something that had nothing to do with the quality of your assessment." She stopped. "I needed to say that to your face. I've needed to say it for 14 months. Maya looked at her. Lena Harlow had the eyes of someone who had been angry for a long time and had figured out that anger was only useful when it was pointed at the right thing, and was now sitting across from the person who had tried to protect her and her dog and had been overruled for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them. And the expression on her face was not quite grief and not quite relief, but the specific thing that lived between them. "Thank you," Maya said. It came out without the stutter, which still surprised her sometimes. The way certain kinds of directness came out clean, before the self-consciousness could catch up. "I'm testifying Monday," Lena said. "At the federal inquiry. I've been scheduled for 3 months." "So am I found out last night." Lena nodded slowly. "Then I'll see you there." She picked up her coffee again. "For what it's worth, I've talked to other handlers, people who worked with dogs that went through the Fort Calvin recovery program during your time there. They know what you did. They might not know your name yet, but they know something was different about those animals when they came back." She paused. "They say the dogs came back softer, not weaker, softer. Like they'd been somewhere that let them put something down." Maya sat with that for a moment. "That was the whole idea," she said quietly. Lena stayed for 40 minutes. When she left, she paused at the door and looked at Maya with the directness of someone who had one more thing and had decided to say it. "What they did to you, dismissing you because of the way you speak, that's the part I can't get past. The rest of it, the budget fraud, the operation yesterday, all of it. That's criminal, and it's going to be treated as criminal. But what they did to you specifically, using your voice as an excuse to ignore your mind..." She stopped. "I just want you to know that I saw it, and I'm going to say so, on the record." Maya held the doorframe for a moment after Lena walked down the steps and back to her car. The morning was cool and quiet, the neighborhood still in the particular stillness of a Saturday that hadn't fully woken up. A dog was being walked by an elderly man 2 houses down, moving with the unhurried patience of a very old animal that had long since made peace with its pace. She watched them until they turned the corner. Then she went inside and started preparing for Monday. Mom, the federal inquiry into the Joint K9 program budget. Irregularities and related obstruction. That was the full official name, which nobody used. Everyone called it the Fort Calvin hearing, convened on a Monday morning in a federal building 40 minutes from Cedar Ridge. The room was larger than Maya had expected. A formal hearing chamber with tiered seating for the panel, a witness table below, and a gallery that had filled up to a degree that suggested this had become, in the 4 days since the events at the hospital, a story with more visibility than anyone had initially anticipated. She'd seen the news coverage in fragments over the weekend: a federal security breach at a protected medical facility, a witness narrowly extracted, 2 suspects in custody, a 3rd under investigation. Her name hadn't appeared in any of it, which she'd appreciated, though she understood it wouldn't last. She arrived early. She sat outside the chamber on a hard wooden bench in the corridor and went through her notes, which were not extensive because she'd decided the night before that she wasn't going to perform preparation. She knew what she knew. The question was whether she could say it in a room designed to make saying things difficult. Holt found her in the corridor at 8:40. He was in a suit rather than the field jacket she'd seen him in all week, which made him look slightly less like himself. He sat on the bench beside her without ceremony. "How are you doing?" he said. "I'm okay." She folded her notes. "How's Harlan?" "Good. He testified last Thursday via secure video link. He was good." Holt looked at his own hands. Wickfield was formally charged Friday evening. 17 counts: wire fraud, obstruction, conspiracy to interfere with a federal witness, accessory after the fact on the hospital operation. Reeves picked up 12 counts. They're in separate facilities. Maya processed that. "They're not going to walk out of this." "No," Holt said. He said it without satisfaction, just as a fact. "They're not." "And the program? The K9 program?" "Under review. But the unit itself is intact. The operational side, the handlers, the dogs, that's all solid. What's being unwound is the administrative layer above it." He paused. "The adaptable recovery framework has been formally credited in the program documentation. Your name is attached to it now. That happened Thursday, as part of the evidentiary record." Maya looked at the wall across from her. She'd put her name on a methodology that had been borrowed and built on and used to justify budget allocations that funded a fraud, and the strange circularity of that was something she was still working out how to feel about. The work had been real. The dogs it had helped were real. The rest of it had been done around her, without her, in the shape of something that looked like her contribution from the outside but had been gutted from the inside. Getting the name back didn't undo any of that. It was just the correct thing. She'd learned the difference between correction and repair. "Thank you," she said, "for moving fast on the documentation." "It was the right thing to do." He stood when a clerk appeared at the chamber door to indicate the session was beginning. "You go forth. After Lena Harlow." She nodded. "Maya." He said her name the same way he had in the conference room, without apparent decision, just the way it came out. "You're going to be fine in there." "I know," she said. Not bravado, just the accurate assessment of a person who had decided to stop arranging themselves around other people's comfort. She went in. The gallery was a presence she registered and then set aside. The panel was 5 people. 3 she didn't know, 1 she recognized from news coverage as a federal oversight commissioner, and 1 who turned out to be a senior Department of Justice official who had the expression of someone who had reviewed a large number of documents over the past 4 days and had formed strong opinions about all of them. She noted them and then stopped looking at them, because watching a panel was a way of anticipating their reaction, and she'd decided not to do that today. She watched Lena Harlow testify first. Lena was a composed witness in the specific way of someone who had organized her anger into something usable. She spoke about the mission, the operational conditions, Keller's performance, her own injury, and then she spoke about what she'd learned in the 14 months since, about the flag that had been submitted and dismissed, about the documentation she'd read. Her voice was steady throughout except for one moment when she described reading Maya's original risk assessment on Keller and recognizing in retrospect exactly what it had described and exactly what had happened. "She was right," Lena said, simply, into the record. Every specific thing she identified in that document was what occurred in the field. She was right, and she was dismissed, and the stated reason for the dismissal was that her communication style made her assessments unreliable. She looked at the panel. "I'm a Federal K9 handler. My job is to trust an animal's assessment of an environment over my own intuition. I trust animals to tell me things that language can't communicate. And I can tell you from that professional standpoint that the reliability of an assessment has nothing to do with how quickly the words come out." The chamber was very quiet. Maya was called forth, as Holt had said. She walked to the witness table, adjusted the microphone slightly, and sat down. The room was large enough that sound did things in it. There was a moment of ambient echo as she settled that made everything feel temporarily louder than it was. She gave her name. She stated her professional history. The panel's lead questioner, the DOJ official, walked her through the Fort Calvert timeline, and she answered each question in the order it was asked, without adding to it and without subtracting from it. She described the Keller assessment. She described submitting the documentation. She described the dismissal and the language used to deliver it. The program director stated in the formal dismissal response that and I'm quoting the document here, "verbal communication difficulties create a meaningful deficit in risk assessment reliability, as effective risk communication requires clarity and speed," the questioner said. "How did you respond to that at the time?" Maya looked at the microphone. "I requested a written review of the assessment itself, the content of the documentation, independent of how it had been verbally presented in the briefing." She paused. "The request was denied. The review was of the communication, not the assessment. So the methodology of the review was flawed. The methodology was designed to produce a specific outcome," she said. She said it without heat, just with precision. "If you evaluate the quality of an assessment by the speed of the person presenting it, you will always be able to dismiss the assessment of someone with a speech disorder. It's a circular system. The conclusion was built into the criteria." The DOJ official looked at the panel. "Ms. Whitmore," the oversight commissioner said. She was a compact woman in her 60s with the unhurried quality of someone who had asked questions in rooms like this for decades and had learned to distinguish the ones that needed immediate answers from the ones that needed space. "You left the program rather than pursuing a formal appeal. Can you explain that decision?" Maya had prepared for this one. She'd prepared for it because it was the question she'd asked herself the most, over 3 years, in the form of every version of "I should have," and "why didn't I," and "what if." "I had submitted documentation," she said. It was reviewed and dismissed on grounds that had nothing to do with the quality of the documentation. If I appealed the dismissal, I would be required to argue the reliability of my communication in a system that had already entered its conclusion about my communication into the formal record. She stopped, organized the next part. There's a specific kind of situation where the process itself is the obstruction, where using the formal mechanism requires you to demonstrate the very thing the formal mechanism has already decided you can't demonstrate. She looked at the commissioner. I was 29 years old. I had watched a dog I knew wasn't ready be deployed over my explicit objection. I didn't have the resources at the time to fight a documented institutional conclusion with the same institution that had documented it. She paused. I want to be clear about something, she said. I wasn't wrong to leave. I've spent 3 years telling myself I should have stayed and fought, but what I've understood this week is that leaving was a reasonable response to an unreasonable system. What was wrong was the system, not my decision to stop subjecting myself to it. The chamber was very still. What I want on the record, Maya continued, is not just that my assessment of Keller was correct. It's that the mechanism used to dismiss it, the mechanism of evaluating risk assessment reliability through verbal presentation speed, was itself a form of discriminatory practice. Other specialists with other kinds of communication differences were vulnerable to the same dismissal. I'm one documented case. I'm probably not the only one. The commissioner wrote something down. The questioner looked at his notes. In your time at Fort Calvern, you developed what is now documented in the Federal K9 program as the Adaptable Recovery Framework. Can you describe the core principle of that methodology? The core principle, Maya said, is that trust cannot be fast-tracked. She let that sit for a moment. Animals that have experienced trauma, lost handlers, field injuries, sustained stress, they don't recover on an administrative timeline. The original recovery protocol was a 6-week cycle because 6 weeks fit the budget allocation period, but trauma doesn't resolve on a budget cycle. She looked at the panel. The animals I worked with needed time and consistency and the specific experience of having a human present who wasn't asking them to be ready before they were ready. That's not a complicated methodology. It's patience applied with intention, and the recovery rate under your approach versus the standard protocol. Under the standard protocol, the washout rate, dogs assessed as unrecoverable and removed from service, was over 60% in the cases I reviewed. In the cohort I worked with directly, the return-to-service rate was 78%, with a significantly lower re-injury rate in the 2 years following return. She paused. The remaining 22% were retired, not because they'd failed recovery, but because the assessment indicated that service wasn't compatible with their long-term well-being. There's a difference between those two outcomes. The difference being, a dog retired because it's unrecoverable has been failed by the system, Maya said. A dog retired because it's been genuinely assessed as having given what it can give and deserves a different life. That's a different thing entirely. She stopped. Titan, the K9 who identified the threat at Cedar Ridge last week. Titan was flagged as unrecoverable under the standard protocol. He's currently active, and he's been active for 3 years, and he identified a threat that prevented a federal witness from being assassinated. She didn't say it with triumph. She said it with the plain flatness of a fact that didn't require decoration. The methodology works. The testimony concluded 40 minutes later. She answered 6 more questions from 2 other panel members. Specific operational questions about the Cedar Ridge events, about what she'd observed in Vane's toolbox, about the layout information she'd provided to Holt. She answered them the same way she'd answered everything else, specifically and without embellishment. When it was done, she walked out of the chamber and back into the corridor and sat on the same wooden bench she'd started on. Lena Harlow was waiting there. She had a cup of coffee from somewhere and handed it to Maya without asking, and Maya took it and drank it, and they sat together in the corridor for a few minutes without talking, which was its own kind of complete. "You did well in there," Lena said. "I said what I knew," Maya said. "That's all it was? That's all it ever needs to be." The inquiry concluded its public sessions over the following 3 days. The findings were released 4 weeks later in a 200-page report that Maya read in full over a weekend, sitting at her kitchen table with the printed document and a pen, marking the sections she needed to understand clearly and setting aside the sections that were procedural and legal in ways that required a different kind of expertise than she had. The report documented in formal federal language the following: that Director Reeves of the Fort Calvern K9 Recovery Program had systematically manipulated program documentation to inflate output metrics and justify inflated budget allocations that were then diverted through shell entities controlled by Reeves and Special Agent Tomas Wickfield. That the dismissal of risk assessment documentation submitted by trauma specialist Maya Whitmore in connection with the Keller deployment constituted both an act of individual discrimination and a component of a deliberate pattern of suppressing adverse findings that threatened program metrics. That the adaptable recovery framework, developed by Whitmore during her tenure at Fort Calvern, had been incorporated into Federal K9 program operations without attribution or compensation, and that the methodology had demonstrably improved both animal welfare outcomes and operational performance in the units where it had been implemented. On page 87, there was a formal recommendation that the methodology be renamed and formally attributed, and that the attribution be entered into the permanent federal program record. The recommended name was the Whitmore Recovery Protocol. She read that page 3 times, not because she didn't believe it, because she needed to let it be real in the specific way that things became real when you read them multiple times, and they said the same thing each time, and you had to accept that the world had changed a specific shape around you, and the shape was better than the one that had been there before. Reeves was sentenced 8 weeks after the inquiry concluded. 11 years, federal facility, forfeiture of pension, and program-related assets. The sentencing was covered in the news, not extensively. It was the kind of story that got moderate coverage, enough for people who were looking for it to find it. Maya didn't watch the coverage. She read the sentencing document, which was public record, and she noted the charges and the outcomes, and then she closed the browser. Wickfield received 14 years. His sentencing was covered more extensively because his seniority made the story more legible to the people who write those stories. There were photographs of him entering the federal courthouse in the suit he'd worn to the Cedar Ridge debrief, which she noticed and then stopped thinking about. The shell companies were dissolved. The diverted funds were traced, partially recovered, partially unrecoverable. The contractor payments were audited. 3 other individuals with connections to the network were charged on lesser counts. The K9 program continued. On the 3rd Tuesday of October, 7 weeks after the inquiry, Maya arrived at Cedar Ridge at 6:47 a.m. and walked through the staff entrance and went to the break room and poured her coffee from the thermos she'd brought from home. The morning was ordinary. The shift assignment sheet was under her locker door. East Wing, 3rd floor, post-surgical recovery. Priya was in the break room when she arrived. Not with Diane this time, alone, pouring her own coffee, and she looked at Maya when she came in with an expression that had been reconfiguring itself for 7 weeks and still hadn't entirely landed. "Maya," she said. "Morning." Priya held her mug. "I read the inquiry report," she said. "The summary, the public one." Maya waited. "I owe you an apology," Priya said. She said it without building up to it, just placed it there directly, which took something. Not for any specific thing, for the general thing, for treating you like you were less than you were. Maya looked at her. Priya was not performing this. She was uncomfortable, and she was saying it anyway, which was the version of an apology that meant something. "Thank you," Maya said. She meant it the same way she'd meant it with Linda. "I don't know if that's enough," Priya said. "It's a start," Maya said. "A real start is enough." She went to her floor. Mr. Garfield was still there. He'd had a complication in week 2, and his discharge had been pushed back, which he'd informed her of with the exasperated energy of a man who blamed the complication personally and was still working out who to blame it on. He looked up when she came into 318 that morning and lowered his crossword magazine. "You're back," he said. "I'm back. I saw you on the news." He said it conversationally, the way he said most things, which meant he'd been sitting on it and had decided this was the moment. "The federal thing." "Briefly," she said. She checked his IV line. The report said they named a protocol after you. The inquiry report, yes. He looked at his magazine, looked at her. I told you, he said, when you first came in here. I told you to find a different career. You did. He shifted in the bed. I was wrong about that. You didn't know, she said. Still, he opened the crossword magazine and then didn't look at it. 12-letter word, steadfast in quiet courage. She thought about it for a moment. Resolute, she said. But that's 8. You're right, he squinted. Indefatigable? That's 14. He counted on his fingers, conceded the point. She finished her notes on his chart, and she was at the door when he said, without looking up from the magazine, for the record, I've had a lot of nurses, in a lot of hospitals. He paused. You're the best one. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Thank you, Mr. Garfield, she said. Don't make it weird, he said, and turned back to his crossword. She laughed. It surprised her. The way it came out complete and real, in the corridor of a post-surgical ward on an ordinary Tuesday, and she went on to her next patient with it still in her chest. The formal recognition ceremony was held on a Friday afternoon in late November, in a federal building in the city, in a room with too many chairs and a podium and a banner that said Joint Federal K9 Program, Annual Citation Ceremony, in a font that tried hard to be both official and welcoming and achieved something in between. Maya had been told the ceremony would take 30 minutes. It took 75 because these things always did. Commander Holt was there, Deputy Director Sloan. Lena Harlow, who was in dress uniform and stood with the particular upright posture of someone who was proud and was allowing themselves to show it. Several handlers Maya didn't know, but whose faces had the quality of people who had been briefed on who she was and had made their own assessment of what that meant. And 12 German shepherds. She'd been told they would be there, but being told and seen were different. And when the unit was brought into the room in measured formation, she felt it in her chest the way she felt the things that mattered. Not the performed version of being moved, but the physical reality of it, the small, involuntary catch. Titan was at the front of the formation. His handler gave a quiet signal and Titan broke to the right. Not erratically, deliberately, the controlled movement of an animal that had been given permission to do what it already intended to do, and he crossed the room and sat beside Maya's chair the way he had sat beside her chair in the conference room at Cedar Ridge, in the corridor of the 3rd floor, in the lobby on the evening she'd left, like a fixed point she carried without knowing it. She put her hand on his head. He exhaled. The citation was read aloud by the DOJ official from the inquiry panel. It was specific and formal and used words like distinguished contribution and foundational methodology and redress of documented institutional failure, and Maya listened to it the way she listened to things that required her to stay present in them, rather than retreating to the part of her brain that managed and processed and kept a careful distance. Holt gave a brief address. He was a better public speaker than his field manner had suggested, which didn't entirely surprise her. The events of this past fall, he said, involved a number of failures. Institutional failures, failures of oversight, failures of individual integrity at a senior level. I'm not going to dress those up, but embedded in those failures was something that worked. A methodology, a set of principles, a way of treating damaged things with the patience they needed rather than the speed that served the institution's convenience. He looked at Maya. That didn't come from a committee. It came from one person who saw something clearly and said so, and was dismissed and found another way to show up and do the work anyway. He paused. The Whitmore recovery protocol's in our program documentation now. It's going to stay there. I want the name to mean something to the people who use it. She was given a citation in a frame and a federal program commendation and a letter from the DOJ office that was formal and specific and would go into her permanent professional record. Then Sloan stepped to the podium and said, I'd like to invite Ms. Whitmore to say a few words, if she's willing. Maya hadn't been warned about this. She looked at Sloan. Sloan had the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was standing behind it, which was, Maya had come to understand, just how she looked. Maya stood. She walked to the podium. She adjusted the microphone. It was too high, the way microphones were always set for people who didn't account for her height. She looked at the room, the handlers with their dogs. Holt, Lena, Sloan, the federal officials who had spent a fall processing a story that had started with a toolbox and a dog that remembered where it came from, the chairs that were almost all full. She thought about what to say. She thought about the speech she'd have given 3 years ago. The careful, abbreviated version, the one designed to fit inside the shape of what she imagined the room expected from her. The version built around minimizing the pause between words, getting through it fast enough that people wouldn't have time to decide what the pause meant. She let that version go. "I want to say something about the D-Dogs first," she said, "because they're the part of this story that most people find hardest to explain, and I think that's worth addressing." She looked at Titan, who was watching her from beside her empty chair with his ears forward. "The reason those animals remembered me is not complicated. I spent months with them during the worst period of their lives. I didn't try to fix them on a schedule. I didn't push them past what they could carry on a given day. I showed up consistently, and I was honest with them about what I was asking, and I waited." She paused. "Animals remember that. They remember it better than most institutions do." Someone in the gallery made a sound that might have been a laugh. She kept going. "What happened to me at Fort Calvern was wrong," she said. "I want to say that plainly because I've spent 3 years finding softer ways to frame it, and the softer framings were, I think they were a way of making it easier for everyone around me to be comfortable with what happened. The truth is that I submitted an accurate risk assessment, and it was dismissed because of the way I speak, and the consequence of that dismissal was that an animal and a handler were put in danger that could have been avoided." She stopped, breathed. "I'm not saying that to perform it. I'm saying it because the record needed it said out loud. In a room. By me." The room was very still. "I also want to say something about the 3 years in between," she said, "because I know there are people who look at what happened and think, she was wronged, she persisted, she was vindicated, the end. And that's true as far as it goes. But the in-between part, that's where most people actually live. The years where you know something was true, and the institution says it wasn't, and you have to decide every day whether to keep carrying what you know or put it down." She looked at the back of the room, past the people she knew, at the people she didn't. "I didn't handle those years perfectly. I made myself smaller than I needed to be. I was so careful about not causing discomfort that I caused a different kind of damage. I let the dismissal become part of how I thought about myself." She paused. "I don't think I'm supposed to admit that at an official recognition ceremony, but I think it's the true thing, and I've decided today that I'm going to say the true things." She looked down at Titan, still in his place beside her chair. "My words take longer to arrive than other people's words," she said. "They always have. I used to spend a significant amount of energy apologizing for that, managing the room's reaction to the pause, filling the space before someone else could fill it with the assumption that the pause meant I had nothing to say." She stopped. "I'm done doing that. The pause is just the pause. What comes after it is worth the wait. I know that now in a way I didn't know 3 years ago, and I'm not sure I'd know it now if the path had been easier." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not grateful for what was done, but I'm not destroyed by it either. And the difference between those two things, that gap, that's where I live now." She looked at Holt, at Lena, at the dogs arranged in formation with their handlers, 12 animals who had been somewhere broken and had found their way back through time and patience and the specific human decision to treat their recovery as worth the investment. "The Whitmore Recovery Protocol is about patience as a practice," she said, "about the choice to let something take as long as it actually takes, instead of as long as it's convenient for it to take. I hope it's useful. I hope it keeps dogs in the field and keeps handlers safe. But I also hope—" She stopped, found the next sentence. "I hope it reminds the people who use it that slow is not the same as broken, and that the pace of someone's arrival doesn't determine the value of what they bring." She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for one full second, the kind of quiet that wasn't absence but accumulation, the specific silence of a room that had received something and was still taking it in. And then the handlers started, and the federal officials, and Lena, and Holt, who put his hands together with the decisive energy of a man who did not do things by halves, and the sound built in the room the way sounds built in rooms when they meant it. Maya walked back to her chair. Titan pressed his head against her hand without being asked. She sat with that, with the noise of the room and the weight of the dog beside her, and the fact of her name on a protocol that would outlast this afternoon and everything it had cost to get here. And she let it be real without trying to manage what it meant. She had spent 3 years being the person who arrived early and stayed invisible and packaged herself in the shape of least resistance. She had spent a long time believing that smallness was a kind of safety. It wasn't. It was just a different kind of loss, slower and quieter than the one that had been done to her, but loss all the same. The room was still applauding. She looked out at it, at the people who had finally stopped deciding what the pause meant and had waited long enough to hear what came after it. And she thought that this was what it felt like when the world adjusted to the shape of you instead of the other way around. Not perfect. Not resolved into something clean. There were things she'd still have to carry. The years, the stutter that would still stop a room, the Tuesday mornings when she would still reach for the thermos instead of the communal mug out of the ingrained habit of taking up less space. But she would reach, and then she would notice herself reaching, and she would decide on purpose whether that was the choice she still wanted to make. That was different. That was everything. Titan shifted beside her, settling his full weight against her leg with the comfortable certainty of an animal who had come a long distance to be exactly where he was and had no intention of being anywhere else. She left her hand on his back. The room continued.